Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 GZERO Japan Summit. This is Eurasia Group's annual gathering of some of the world's top leaders and policymakers on the most pressing global issues of the moment. I'm Sherry-Ann, anchor at Bloomberg Television. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsors, PwC Japan and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with our partners from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the Keidanren, and the Japan Association of Corporate Executives. This event would not be possible without their support. Today, we're talking about the long-term impacts of COVID, especially how Asia's businesses and economies can grow despite ongoing disruptions. Just last week, yet another COVID-19 variant, Omicron, made headlines and once again disrupted international travel. This has now become one of the first tests of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Here now to kick off today's summit is the Prime Minister himself in an exclusive taped message.
内閣総理大臣の岸田文雄です。G0 サミットがオンライン形式とはいえ、今年も盛大に開催されることを嬉しく思います。戸倉経団連会長、桜田経済同友会代表幹事、そしてイアン・ブレマー氏の下で、今後の世界の展望を開く活発な議論が交わされることを期待いたします。人類が生み出した資本主義は効率性や起業家精神、活力を生み、長きにわたり世界経済の繁栄をもたらしてきました。歴史を振り返ると、資本主義はそのメリットとデメリットの間の微妙なバランスを取りながら進化してきました。20世紀半ばに行われた福祉国家建設に向けた取り組み、その後の新自由主義の広まりはいずれもそうした資本主義の進化の過程でした。今、資本主義はさらなる進化を求められています。1980年代以降、世界の主流となった新自由主義的な考えは、世界経済の成長の原動力となった反面、多くの弊害も生みました。市場に依存しすぎたことで、格差や貧困が拡大し、また自然に負荷をかけすぎたことで、気候変動問題が深刻化しました。世界では、米中関係をはじめ、地政学的緊張が高まる局面にあり、ドクター・ブレマーが指摘する G0 の度合いが強まっています。この緊張の一つの本質は、経済社会そのもののバージョンアップの立ち遅れにあります。これまでの市場偏重、株主偏重の資本主義がもたらした歪みが、選挙ポピュリズムや偏狭なナショナリズムの形で健全な民主主義にシワを寄せています。また、権威主義的な国も格差拡大や権力と富の癒着という歪みにさらされ、軍事的拡張、国民への監視強化などの形にシワを寄せています。これ以上問題を放置することはできないというのが主要先進国共通の思いではないでしょうか。米国ではビルドバックベター、欧州では次世代 EU という新たな資本主義モデルを模索する動きが始まっています。これらの政策に共通するコンセプトは、資本主義が生むさまざまな弊害を是正しながら、力強い成長を実現し、国家を、そして国民を豊かにするというものです。岸田政権では、私のイニシアティブの下で、人への分配を強化することや、今後の成長分野でもある気候変動やデジタル化、経済安全保障といった分野に官と民が共に役割を果たしながら大胆な投資を行うことで、成長と分配の好循環による新しい資本主義を実現する方針を打ち出しました。来春には新しい資本主義のグランドデザインを公表し、世に問うつもりです。世界に向けて発信し、同じ問題意識を持つ主要国の首脳とともにグローバルの議論を牽引します。今回、 G0 サミットでは健康安全保障、国際ルール、気候変動問題が主な議題だと聞いています。いずれも経済社会の持続可能性に関わる重要な論点であり、私が掲げる新しい資本主義の議論と極めて親和性が高いテーマです。経済社会の持続可能性こそが私の問題意識の根幹です。健康安全保障、国際ルール、気候変動など経済社会活動の持続可能性を脅かすリスクに対応しつつ、官と民が役割分担をしながら協働して国家そして国民が豊かになるための経済社会システムを作っていきます。そのための第一歩として私は以下の取り組みを行います。第一に健康安全保障です。我々は新型コロナの脅威を社会全体として可能な限り引き下げます。そのためにワクチン、無料検査、飲める治療薬の普及に取り組み、予防・発見から早期治療までの一連の流れを抜本的に強化します。今回の経験を踏まえ、我々は国内ワクチン、治療薬の開発・製造に5000億円を投資することにしました。こうした取り組みにより、我が国のレジリエンスを高めるとともに、新たな成長の種を生むことを狙います。第2に、国際ルールについてです。新しい資本主義の時代に求められる重要な国際ルールは、デジタル分野におけるルールです。信頼性のある自由なデータ流通 DFFT の実現に向けた国際的なルール作りを主導し、自由で公正な経済秩序を構築し、世界経済の回復、新たな成長を後押しします。国内的には、新しく設立したデジタル庁を司令塔として、早急にデジタル原則を定め、社会全体のデジタルトランスフォーメーションを進めます。第3に気候変動の問題です。気候変動問題など人類共通の社会課題を新たな市場を生む成長分野へと大きく転換していきます。2050年カーボンニュートラルおよび2030年の 46% 排出削減の実現に向け、再エネ最大限導入のための規制の見直しおよびクリーンエネルギー分野への大胆な投資を進めます。火力発電のゼロエミッション化に向け、アンモニアや水素への燃料転換を進めます。我が国の技術やインフラの力を高め、同じようなエネルギー事情を抱えるアジアを中心とした国々の脱炭素化に貢献していきます。世界において GZERO の傾向が強まる中で、日本は米国、ASEAN、豪州、インドなどとともに FOIP を実現し、またクアッドをさらに実りあるものにしていく責任を強く背負っています。我が国は堅固な日米関係を基軸としながら、地政学的な緊張や気候変動をはじめとする地球規模の課題をイノベーションとダイナミックな活力、そしてフリー、フェア、オープンな価値観の浸透によって解決していくソリューションパワーとして地域のリーダーシップを取ることで全力を尽くしてまいります。改めてこのように盛大に G0 サミット2021が行われることを心からお喜び申し上げ、開会にあたってのご挨拶とさせていただきます。
I'd like to thank Prime Minister Fumio Kishida for those remarks and here to talk more about what was said and also to discuss the broader economic outlook. Joining us now is Koichi Hagiuda, Japan's Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. Welcome, Minister. Thank you very much for your time. So we've heard right now from Prime Minister Fumio Kishida speaking about a virtuous cycle of growth and distribution under a new form of capitalism. Tell us, what measures exactly will your ministry take in order to really bring forth this vision of the Kishida administration?
はい、ありがとうございます。
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Hagiuta, at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. As the world faces major transformation of the industrial structure, such as digitalization, decarbonization, investment in people must be consistent with the needs of the industry. By the way, investment by Japanese companies into people have been lower compared to other countries in terms of the percentage against GDP, and we believe this needs to be reversed. First, we need to urge Japanese companies to carry out the management that view people as assets. Employment systems that are unique to Japan needs to be reviewed, and we will seek human resource development that is seamlessly connected to the world. Also, we will carry out initiatives to enable individuals to demonstrate their capacity to the fullest. As we pursue a new work style in the post-COVID era, we will support creating a climate that will facilitate remote work and side job as well as second jobs. Also, in order to make corporate investment in people more visible, we will pursue disclosure of non-financial information. This will encourage investment from abroad and translate into a virtuous cycle of growth and distribution. Thank you.
Health security, a key pillar for a strong economy. What measures is the Japanese government taking to stop the spread of COVID-19?
今般の新型コロナウイルス、
Well, this COVID-19
ワクチンがこれまでと比べて異例の速さで実用化できた背景には、ベンチャー企業である
The backdrop of the unusually rapid pace of commercialization of COVID-19 vaccines compared to vaccines is the contribution of a diverse range of companies in the private sector. Venture capital such as BioNTech and Moderna pursue development to companies that specialize in contract manufacturing such as Lonza carried out manufacturing. In order to ensure health security, the key is whether we can leverage such private sector capacity. In June this year, a cabinet decision was reached on strategy for domestic production of vaccines so that we can respond to even more potent variants and infectious disease that could potentially be a threat in the future. As far as METI is concerned, we intend to assist in the development of dual-use production facilities, which will produce biomedicine in terms of peace and can be converted to produce vaccines in times of emergency. That is what we would like to do. We will also invest close to 300 billion yen to reinforce the ecosystem for drug discovery ventures that will develop new drugs, including vaccines. Assistance to dual-use production facilities is a pilot project for the new form of capitalism which Prime Minister Kishida is pursuing, and that private sector facilities will be used in times of emergency based on requests from the public sector. We are resolved to protect the lives of the people of Japan and exert our utmost efforts to build a system that will contribute to the global health security by bringing together the power of public and the private sector. Thank you.
The Biden administration has shown great interest in the Indo-Pacific region. How is the Japanese government helping to build an economic order in the region?
はい、インド太平洋地域がイノベーションとダイナミックな活力を通じて経済成長と気候変動等の地球規模の課題解決を両
for the
立させ
Indo-Pacific region to make compatible economic growth and the solving of global issues such as that of climate change through innovation and dynamic vitality, the development of a free, fair, and open economic order is crucial. As the cabinet minister in charge of the region, I would like to properly address the following 3 points. First, we must achieve high-quality economic partnerships. We will work toward the steady implementation and expansion of the CPTPP while maintaining its high standards. With regard to the RCEP, which will enter into force in January next year, we will work with the countries concerned to ensure its full implementation by all parties. Secondly, data free flow with trust, or DFFT, is an important foundation for economic and social development through digital transformation. We look forward to working with like-minded countries to ensure that multilateral rules are developed through the WTO and the data free flow principles of the CPTPP and RCEP are steadily implemented by the countries. Finally, in the context of regional development, it is essential for the United States to strengthen its involvement in building the economic order. In this context, we welcome the stance of the Biden administration. In my own meeting with Commerce Secretary Raimondo and U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Tai last month, I discussed the U.S.-Japan cooperation in the region. We wish to continue to work with the United States and the other countries concerned.
Let's talk a little bit about the long-term implications for the regional economy and the world. Decarbonization, of course, and the climate crisis being very important. What are some of the measures that Japan is taking in order to collaborate for decarbonization in the Asian region?
はい、今後成長の見込まれるアジアでは、依然
Fossil fuels are still an important source of energy in Asia, where growth is expected to continue. In order to achieve a realistic energy transition in Asia, that is a transition toward decarbonization, it is necessary to support the use of all energy sources and technologies, taking into account the circumstances of each country. To this end, Japan has proposed the Asian Energy Transition Initiative as a comprehensive support measure. Based on this initiative, Japan will support the development of roadmaps based on the situation of each country, provide financial assistance to the tune of $10 billion, as well as support for innovation and human resource development. As the Prime Minister has mentioned, in particular, we will develop a $100 million initiative to convert existing fossil fuel-fired power plants on which many Asian countries depend to zero-emission power plants that use ammonia and hydrogen, among others. We wish to work closely with Asian countries through this initiative to ensure that they are able to reduce their emissions while balancing economic development and the lives of their citizens.
Minister Hagiuda, thank you very much for your time today. We do appreciate those remarks. That was Koichi Hagiuda, Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan. Right. Coming off that conversation, of course, the climate crisis was one of those issues that we mentioned, supply chain disruptions, the ongoing pandemic, of course, key challenges for the global economic recovery, especially across Asia as well. Let's discuss what's ahead for the Asian economic recovery picture. And joining us now is Deborah Elms, founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center, David Gorton, former chairman of Eurasia Group, also Alicia Garcia-Herrero, chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis. Thank you all for joining us today. It's great to have you with us. Alicia, let me start with you because I just saw that Natixis recently released their 2022 Asia Outlook. You're expecting growth to stabilize to 4.7% in 2022. Does the Omicron variant impact this forecast at all?
Well, it's too early to answer that question, but what I think I would take away from Omicron is that we're not out of the woods yet. It could be Omicron, it could be any other letter, and I think that's what we know. And what we also know is that Asia, as a region, is actually prone to taking tougher measures on the cross-border mobility compared to the rest of the world. To me, that translates into a bigger impact for Asia of any letter we may get this year. And that's indeed a problem, in my opinion, for trade, for supply chain disruptions beyond Asia's actual growth.
Yeah, we're running out of the Greek alphabet right now at this point with all of these variants emerging. Deborah, let me turn to you because Alicia mentioned the supply chain disruptions, right? First of all, what are you seeing right now? Has anything gotten any better?
Yes, supply chain disruption. In general, supply chains have been working, I would argue, quite well, given the enormous headwinds that many companies are facing. So they're doing relatively well. But the challenge is that every time that they sort of start to sort out the kinks in the chain, a new challenge emerges. And so you can't actually resolve past problems because you've got a backlog, and then you start to resolve that, and then you have a new problem on top of it. In particular, as you mentioned, what really matters is the lockdowns and the associated movement restrictions that are creating real headaches for businesses trying to unravel supply chains. And I think that is likely to continue, even if we didn't have new problems, just sorting out the continuing backlog of all of these compounding problems means that supply chain disruption is likely to continue.
Yeah, those COVID zero strategies still continuing in places like China, right? David, let me turn to you. How important is Asia's role in the global supply chain?
Well, I think Asia has a critical role and has played an expanding role in global supply chain. I think the big challenge is that under the impact of supply chain disruptions, a lot of countries have begun to rethink supply chains and how they're dealing with supply chains. So only yesterday, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, made comments about what she felt was a need to create an expanded indigenous supply base in the United States because of the uncertainty of resilience of supply chain. So I do think we're entering into a period where there's going to be tension between the efficiency in supply chains on the one hand and the greater resilience that countries are going to be looking for that will involve some reshoring at home. And that also has a lot of political consequences.
And David, this also coming at a time when even before the pandemic, we were already talking about supply chain issues because of the trade tensions that we've seen between the US and China. We had been talking about this bifurcation happening already. So how does this compound the problem?
Yeah, so I don't think we're heading to bifurcation per se, but I do believe that the deshoring from China that began even before the pandemic is now being thought of much more in terms of reshoring back to some other countries. And we've seen that from Japan, we've seen that from Europe. So it's not just the US. So I do think that the supply chain issue brings together the question of disruptions from COVID and those health-related issues with some more geopolitically sensitive issues having to do with over-reliance or perceived over-reliance on China.
Let's talk a little bit about those geopolitical sensibilities because, Deborah, of course, right now, there's a lot of attention going into China's growing influence in the region, especially when it comes to all of these different regional trade deals that we're talking about, right? Whether it's the new CPTPP or RCEP or the digital economy, DEPA as well. So where does Asia stand among all of these regional trade agreements, and how important are these deals for Asia's increased role in the global economy?
I think they're critical. So if you have a stuck global system, and we had what was meant to be a ministerial meeting last week that was canceled due to COVID, the momentum has been moving for a while to Asia, and I think this just accelerates that. When you don't have the global system working, you look for regional solutions, and Asia has been very forward-leaning, and my hat is off especially to Japan in this regard, in pushing new kinds of trade arrangements. So we have multiple ones in this region. We have the beginning of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that starts on January 1st with 10 countries, including Japan and China, many of the ASEAN members, et cetera. I think that's very important. That will help power growth out of COVID. Also, we have the expansion of the CPTPP with the addition of the United Kingdom, and then we have applications in place now from China and Taiwan, with new applications likely. We'll see how this goes, but the Koreans and the Thais in particular. So that will be very interesting. And then finally, as you mentioned, we have a lot of digital-only agreements or digitally focused agreements in different ways with different markets. And I think all of those show the importance that Asia places on trade and on integration and on maintaining what I think was earlier referenced as sort of free, fair, and open trade. And I think that's critical to the region, and it will help power them out of this COVID situation, assuming, and again, this is a bit of a downside to Asia, that the COVID zero or the particularly strong responses to COVID in terms of government policy and locking down economies is moderated as we go into 2022.
Yeah, we're closely watching those applications by China and Taiwan as well, because, of course, they need unanimous approval from all of those CPTPP members. And we do know that China has had issues with the likes of Australia as well. We have actually heard about this geopolitical rivalry and the tech rivalry from Eurasia Group's Ian Bremmer, not to mention the former Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, talking also about Asia's role in the global economy. Let's take a listen to that first.
Now, The interesting change, of course, in technology compared to traditional geopolitics is that increasingly there are really only two dominant players. And, you know, the Chinese and the Americans are way ahead technologically from other countries. They're also spending multiples of what other countries are on AI research. If you're looking at a country like Japan, that, I mean, clearly needs to invest in China, needs a security umbrella from the United States, but isn't anywhere close to the technological capabilities of either countries, what do you say to them in terms of strategy going forward, holistic macro strategy for a government like Japan?
Japan should do what the United States has done so far, which is should organize an AI partnership. It should get all of the components of the Japanese society that are major players in AI. And remember, there are large companies using AI in Japan, and they need to build an AI strategy for the nation. That AI strategy will include a lot more resources in universities, a lot more people trained in those universities in the government, and an agreement that the AI systems that are going to get built in Japan are consistent with Japanese law, but also Japanese culture and values. That's the only path I know of to do. Japan will be a significant player because of the extraordinary technological capability of Japanese scientists and Japanese software. There's every reason to think that Japan, as well as South Korea, and to some degree India, can be very significant players in this because of the scale they have. This is a game where you need a lot of resources, and Japan has that.
Now, we've talked about software, we haven't talked yet about hardware, and I would really be remiss if I didn't ask you at least a question about the semiconductor story, especially because the United States, China, Japan, one thing we can all agree on is that we need semiconductors from another player, from Taiwan and from TSMC, which also happens to be the locus of some of the sharpest conflict between the United States and China. What do you think happens as a consequence of that? How should policy be formulated?
You know, it's interesting that in the last 20 years, the two really big technical decisions made in the West that now reverberate are the decision that the United States would get out of the semiconductor business except for Intel, and also the lack of focus on building 5G competitors to Huawei. In the case of the semiconductors, what happened was the efficiency of the Asian model, and in particular Taiwan, was so overwhelming that many of the fabs and the other opportunities were foregone in the West. So now we find ourselves in a situation where below 10 microns, and below is faster, smaller, more expensive, more powerful, there are really two players in the space. One is called TSMC, which is the largest company of its type in the world, and it's in Taiwan. It's about half of the foundries. And the other one is Samsung, which of course is a large South Korean conglomerate and very, very good. Those two companies have managed to break this barrier, if you will, and they are critically important for very fast processors, very fast computers, very fast chips in your phone, because they do a combination of speed and very low cost power. All of a sudden, and by the way, it's useful to know that China imports more semiconductor chips than it does oil, to give you a sense of how important semiconductors are in the global supply chain. There is not a good answer strategically for this. Governments have been insisting that TSMC and Samsung build fabs in their own countries. So, for example, TSMC has built fabs in mainland China and is building one in the United States, but they're not at the state of the art. So getting a state of the art fab that's not in Taiwan, not in South Korea, turns out to be a very big deal.
Eric Schmidt there with Ian Bremmer. Alicia, what I found really interesting about this conversation was the opportunity there for other smaller nations across Asia, Korea, for example, with those chip makers. When I cover the markets on Bloomberg TV, I have seen really the incredible gains for all of these semiconductor makers, TSMC, SK Hynix, Samsung Electronics as well. Alicia, are you seeing the benefits for Asian economies already playing out during COVID because of this opportunity that they have to fill the gap in this space?
Yes, we've already actually experienced that since 2020 because we had the semiconductor cycle basically coming up because of 5G implementation in China and beyond. So we've already seen that. The question is, will it continue? And the answer is yes, because we still have the shift to electric vehicles, of course, more 5G coming. So in other words, this is a super cycle. We had the commodity super cycle. We're going to have the semiconductor super cycle, no doubt about it. And that's going to benefit the region, but only parts of the region. Others will continue to import. So, we are talking about regional integration in Asia, rightly so. But let's not forget that some are big importers of semiconductors, China being the largest. So it's not going to be as easy if the rest of the world is also increasing its demand. It's going to be, in a way, a hindrance for some and a great export device for others, South Korea and Taiwan, indeed.
Deborah, what are you hearing on the ground on this dynamic that Alicia is talking about when you speak to governments and private businesses?
Well, let's talk about semiconductors for a moment. Yeah, there are chips that are made all across the region, and governments have tried to keep chip production flowing as much as possible. But one of the challenges that we've seen in COVID is that you may be classified as an essential service, and your staff can get in and make the chips themselves. But what's not an essential service, or what's been a struggle, is something like the cardboard box company that makes the box that you put the chip in at the end. And so one of the challenges, and one of the reasons why we have so many kinks in the supply chain, is that your factory might be up and running and you might be fine in wherever you happen to be, but other parts of the supply chain are not operating as they used to. And so we have this sort of disconnect between the essential services and then what were viewed as unessential services that turn out to be critical, like boxes. And that is compounding some of the challenges in operating. And I think it's perhaps reinforcing in some ways the dominance of some kinds of companies, especially when they are able to say to governments who are receptive, this needs to change because we can't actually operate if we don't have us plus the boxes plus the truck drivers, so all parts of that have to work. And that requires, I think, enlightened governments to say, we understand the challenges and we're going to do what we can to make policy that fits this evolving structure that we have.
Deborah, how do more trade links between all of these countries in the form of regional trade agreements impact these challenges?
Well, I think it particularly, I would say, on RCEP, which is starting, reinforces a trend of making things and supplying things in Asia for Asia. So we have lots of trade in Asia, of course, but typically we've had final markets outside of Asia. And I think RCEP especially, and some of these other regional integration efforts, drive trade in the region for the region. And as you try to diversify and as you try to lower risk and you try to increase certainty, I think firms will start to look towards these trade agreements as one measure of helping them with that problem of reducing risk and increasing certainty in outcomes. We're going to get more trade in Asia for Asia, again, assuming that we can moderate some of the worst impact of COVID lockdowns. It's not so much COVID, because we don't have a lot of, we have COVID, of course, but we don't have the same associated deaths and hospitalization. But what we do have is an awful lot of lockdowns in Asia.
David, let me turn to RCEP, because, of course, our understanding is that this was sort of a China-led initiative. And this, of course, coming at a time when the U.S. administration withdrew from the TPP regional pact. We now have the CPTPP. Minister Hagiuda earlier talked about the Biden administration showing more interest in the Indo-Pacific region. But at the same time, we have seen criticisms that perhaps the administration doesn't have a clear economic vision for the region 5 years after they've already withdrawn from the TPP. How does this really impact the dynamic between the U.S. and China in the region?
So I think that the United States right now is playing with one hand tied behind its back, that it's a critical security partner for many, many, many countries in the region. But we're now in a situation where there's a vacuum in terms of a commercial policy, trade policy, financial policy, all of which we're waiting for. So Catherine Tai, when she was in the region a few weeks ago, said that the administration was going to come up with a framework. Well, there are these frameworks already in the region. So I'm a believer in Occam's razor. And the best solution is often the simplest solution. And I do think that the best solution for the United States is to rethink the decision to not participate in CPTPP and to enter CPTPP. And right now, that's not on the agenda, but I do think the geopolitical logic behind that is very powerful, and that potentially after the midterm elections, I think that geopolitical logic might come to the fore again in U.S. trade policy.
In fact, we have heard from Secretary Raimondo saying that perhaps they will come forth with a new economic framework for the Indo-Pacific region in 2022, perhaps a more formal process, right? Let me wrap this up with Alicia's comments, because I do want to get to China's influence in the region in terms of their economy, because of course we had seen that V-shaped rebound and how that really helped the rest of the world. We are seeing that starting to fade a little bit, and perhaps them coming back with more monetary support. Now that we have this divergence in policies between the Federal Reserve and the PBOC, what will be the implications for Asia?
Great question. I think China is already moving in the opposite direction, which means that juicy interest rate differential in favor of China will no longer be there. So, we can expect less of an appreciation of the renminbi, and frankly, others will not even be able to follow China, i.e. they may have to hike a little bit to stand the pressure of the Fed. And because of the renminbi being weaker, maybe, their currencies won't be able to follow either the dollar. So I expect the region to be on a depreciation mode. And that might be good for growth, because growth, frankly, 2021 was all about external demand, especially in China. So I hope that helps, because otherwise 2022 might not be as as nice as it would have been otherwise. So in a way, it fits the situation, but it is an issue, because if the Fed goes too fast, the rest of Asia will have to really tighten the belts and do more hawkish policies, except for China. I think China is not going to follow. By all means, the economy can't afford it, and that's important to know.
Alicia Garcia-Herrero, also Deborah Elms and David Gordon, thank you very much for your insights today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
And of course, we just ended that conversation on some of the challenges that we might be facing in 2022, with Alicia pointing to perhaps slower economic growth. Let's now discuss what the future holds for Asia. Can lasting positive change really come from this global crisis? Let me bring in our next panelist, TV Narendran, Global CEO and Managing Director of Tata Steel. Also, Kengo Sakurada, Group CEO of Sompo Holdings and Head of the Japan Association of Corporate Executives. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the future and what the private sector can really do in order to really have these changes that were some for the better, some for more positive changes post-COVID, how we can make them last. TV, let me start with you. How important is the public and private partnership dynamic going forward post-pandemic?
Sherry, I think it's extremely important, and the pandemic has demonstrated why it's important. Even if you look at the speed at which the vaccine was developed, the speed at which the vaccination has been done despite many challenges, I think cannot have been done without the public and private sector working together. Second is, I think for global problems like the pandemic and climate change, etc., there is a need to get the innovation capability of the private sector, the agility of the private sector, of course, the financing capability of the private sector, and the resources of the public sector and the weight of the government behind it to solve some of these rather complex problems with socioeconomic consequences. So I think the pandemic has reminded us of the role all of us can play individually and together, and not least the role of the tech companies in driving this change as well.
Kengo, let me turn to you. In what areas can we turn the current crisis of the pandemic into an opportunity? And what role should Japan and private companies play here?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I think pandemic has exaggerated or pushed the problem relating to climate change upward, meaning that we should take the climate change as an opportunity, particularly in the area of private sector like us. And when it's come to climate change, yes, we have to realize carbon neutrality by the end of 2050. And carbon neutrality means balancing emitting and absorbing carbon to achieve net zero emissions, I think. Recently, as we know, the COP26 ended with the Glasgow Climate Pact. It is a specific achievement toward net zero. But it is not suddenly 2050 when I wake up tomorrow. It is necessary to deal with day-to-day issues. For example, at the end of October, crude oil, as you know, its prices reached their highest level in 7 years since 2014. In Europe, Germany has suspended the approval process of the Nord Stream 2, while the price of natural gas has soared about 6 times since the beginning of the year. In theory, economic principles say that supply should follow if demand and price rise. Why doesn't this happen? That is probably because geopolitics, economic and national security, and other related factors are closely, eventually related to climate change, I believe. We must keep in mind both reality and ideals and take actions accordingly. Likewise, what we should avoid toward net zero is to assume that there is only one path to reach it.
Right.
Right. As an example, is it the best solution to replace all vehicle with EVs? I agree it's important to spread EVs, but it also requires a large amount of investment in infrastructure. It could be a heavy economic burden, especially in developing countries.
Right. So you wrote the book Bushido Capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Walk us through that and whether some of the points that you mentioned right now incorporates your concept and your vision for what the new economy should look like.
Thank you very much. Great question. You know, COVID, as everyone said, has highlighted the negative aspect of excessive capitalism, and it causes inequality, fragmented society, climate change, and more. That's why the world is paying attention to new capitalism, as you said. In Japan, Prime Minister Kishida, I'm sure, launched panel to chart path for new capitalism, and I am one of them. I would say Japan is positioned close to realizing new capitalism, which is deeply related to Bushido, as you said. You may doubt my view because Japan has had many unsolved problems, such as economic stagnation over the past 30 years, and massive government deficit, and aging population, and sluggish digitalization. On the other hand, Japan has several strengths, such as good public safety, outstanding technical capability, soft power represented by animation and Japanese food. Particularly, mentality represented by Bushido. Now comes Bushido. I believe Bushido is just what new capitalism needs. May I continue?
Right, please go ahead.
All right. I believe Bushido is embedded deeply into the spirit of Japanese mind. In the early 20th century, Professor Inazo Nitobe was asked by his American wife, why, darling, Japanese usually behave politely that way. He couldn't answer it clearly. But later on, he concluded that Bushido is the basis.
Right.
Bushido is a practical wisdom created over a long time in ancient time. It's not a religion. It's not a philosophy. It is a practical wisdom. Samurai at that time, ruling class, believed that they needed to prioritize the common good of society over personal interest.
Right. So let me turn to TV, because this whole idea of overcoming inequality, really trying to narrow those growing gaps in society, keeps coming up, with whether it's the idea of Bushido capitalism, new capitalism, shareholder capitalism. TV, what does this mean for private businesses?
Sherry, I think private businesses need to recognize that they can't and don't operate in isolation, particularly when you look at what's happening in developing countries. There is an intersection of the corporate world and the socioeconomic challenges that society faces. So I think to have a license to operate, one needs to really be far more balanced in our approach. And, I work with the Tata Group. The group, has always said that the community is not just another stakeholder, but the very purpose of our existence. So if you come with that philosophy, then you'll find a better balance between giving back to the shareholders as well as giving back to the community. And I think today it's very important, because while inequality between nations has in some sense reduced, inequality within countries have increased. And, that will lead to a backlash, which we're already seeing in many societies. And I think there is a need for private sector, for its own longevity, to find solutions which are fairer to the communities who are impacted by their presence.
Surging prices with this inflation debate going on right now will just make it tougher on the most vulnerable in society. TV, tell us a little bit about some of the lessons that you're taking as head of Tata Steel when it comes to perhaps some of the most difficult challenges like supply chain disruptions.
I think we spoke earlier in the panel about, I think Gordon talked about resilience being more important than just pure cost efficiency, which has traditionally been what has driven supply chains across the world. So I think we've been reminded of this multiple times, even in the last decade, whether it was Fukushima, whether it was the floods in Thailand, multiple global events impacted companies across the world. And I think the pandemic has highlighted that, climate change is going to highlight that. And so there is a need to build resilience. And, I think that's the way in which most corporates are looking at supply chains. So that's one part of it. The second part is to build resilience into organizations themselves. How do we prepare our people to respond to these kind of situations? Because given globalization, given the interconnectedness, what happens in one part of the world can easily hit us in some other parts of the world. And sometimes we don't realize that, we don't recognize that. So I think as organizations, we need to be better at anticipating risks, seeing the early signs, having the ability to mitigate it, respond to it. Agility and resilience to me are going to be extremely important. Also a lot more compassion and connectedness to the people who work with us and also the communities who are impacted by us.
TV, the steel industry is very energy intensive. We are now seeing this pushback against fossil fuels. How will that impact your industry?
So it's going to push the industry in two directions. One is there's going to be a greater recycling, which is going to come into the industry. Steel is infinitely recyclable in some sense of the term. So ecosystems will encourage that. Two is you're going to see more use of hydrogen as a replacement for coal, because in our industry, coal is not just an energy source, but it's a reductant in the process. And so you need something like hydrogen to play that role. So these are two things that will happen. And third, I think we all need to plan for circularity. So you need to design for longevity of your product. You need to design for recycling. You need to design for repair, so that overall the efficiency of the industry from a resource efficiency point of view is much better than it is today.
Kengo, you also alluded to this earlier, but how do you reconcile the fact that you need to transition to green energies, but at the same time, you're facing an energy shortage?
That is true. And therefore, as I said, we should be realistic, because we are from business sector. We can't just talk about dreams. And as I said, that 2050 doesn't come all of a sudden. We have to go through gradually and realistically. And in that sense, I would strongly propose we should put more efforts on the development of e-fuel. E-fuel, do you know e-fuel? What do you know? And that will allow all of them to make effective use of internal combustion engines, which is very, very unpopular these days. But if you can use e-fuel successfully, that unpopular words or mechanism can turn it into the dream resources to solve all the problems. Because, for instance, Japan is only responsible for 3.2% of the world in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, to 3.2%. And if we don't create any carbon dioxide at all, it contributes only 3.3% of the world. So what we can do, the private sector, is to create all the passes to achieve net zero society by 2050. And in that sense, I think e-fuel should be the number one, because that could use for not just the combustion engines, but also other power generations, and all the developing countries who are still using a lot of diesel or gasoline engine, or power generation, fossil related. All of them can be saved by use of e-fuel.
Right. So Kengo, you sound very forward-looking, and as your book also states, Bushido capitalism, you have a bigger vision of what the economy should look like. As head of the Japan Association of Corporate Executives, do other business leaders in Japan share such similar views? How in tune are they to what the Kishida administration is hoping to achieve with new capitalism?
Yes, I do believe that most of them with whom I talk to, I discuss, agree to my idea. And particularly, it's such a great coincidence that new Prime Minister declared that Japan will show shortly what should be their next mode of capitalism is. Maybe by the end of next, spring, he will come up with idea. And I am a member of that conference, and I think most of all of executives, not only in big business but also startups, should be able to do that. And this will be the last chance, I think, for Japan to be recognized as a big power, a large power, in a good sense, of course.
TV, we are talking about new capitalism. China has been talking about common prosperity. We continue to hear all of these ideas of wealth distribution. And I think it's been exacerbated by just the divide that COVID-19 really not only brought forward, but really highlighted during the pandemic. India, of course, has suffered greatly from the pandemic as well. What sort of movements on this side of things are you seeing within India, and how does that fit towards a global trend?
So, multiple things are happening in India. One is India, in some sense, is a source of vaccines for the world. India is one of the largest vaccine-making capacities. A lot of it was used for the Indian public, and now India is exporting. So there's a great opportunity for India, in some sense, to continue to grow this sector, and the pharma sector has always been strong in India. Second thing is, I'm relating it to the question you asked earlier. It brought the corporates and the government together. For instance, in India, we had a big problem on oxygen because, huge numbers of people were getting admitted in the hospitals. And this is where the corporate sector got together, because we run oxygen plants, we have oxygen available, and we diverted all that oxygen for medical use. We took care of supply chains because it's a very complex supply chain to transport oxygen. So I think there were many ways in which public, civil society, corporates, and the government work together. And I think that's been certainly a learning for India. India is traditionally underinvested in the healthcare sector as far as the health infrastructure is concerned. I think both at the center and the state now there's far more consciousness. And I think people are far more conscious about the need to keep health as something very important in their lives. So I think in many ways there are some learnings from it, and hopefully we'll benefit from that.
TV, thank you so much for those comments. Kengo as well. This was a very forward-looking conversation. That was, of course, TV Narendran, Global CEO and Managing Director of Tata Steel, also Kengo Sakurada, Group CEO of Sompo Holdings. Thank you to all of our guests and this amazing conversation that we had today. We also want to thank our partners and sponsors, PwC Japan, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the Keidanren, and the Japan Association for Corporate Executives for their continued support. Of course, you can see more from the GZERO Summit tomorrow as well. We do have an all-star panel examining Japan's role in the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Tune in to that live stream tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern in the US, 10 a.m. local time in Japan. I'm Sherry Yan for all of us here. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank